This is Agriculture Today. I'm Samantha Bennett with the K-State Radio Network. Ahead of us today on this Friday's programming, we start with our weekly grain market update, which is, as always, provided by K-State grain market economist Dan O'Brien. He explains the recent drops in futures and some of the global political changes and conflicts that might ultimately affect the markets on a global scale. We also have with us Ron Graber, K-State watershed specialist. He shares with us his best management practice tips when it comes to maintaining water quality, especially in regards to livestock. We end this Friday's program, as always, with this week's agricultural weather update from K-State meteorologist Chip Redmond, who shares a not-so-optimistic outlook, but some precipitation hopefully in the next week or so. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. This is Agriculture Today. We are back now for our weekly grain market update, and that, of course, is coming to us from Dan O'Brien. He is a grain market economist for us here at K-State. Let's start, as always, with some of the future markets that we've seen, specifically with corn. Let's start with.
It's been a really volatile ride from the highs we'd seen back in early May up to about 780. Now we're seeing the lead September contract closing yesterday about 575 3/4. And I think that most Kansas farmers that see, at least in the western half to two-thirds of the state, see their crops under great stress, if not having dried up from hot weather. They're wondering how that is possible. So I think that the trends that have been caused by some hope for resolution in the Ukraine, we'll have to see in the Ukraine-Russia war, the possibility of them shipping some grain out of that, that's an issue. There is a forecast in the next week or so, and I think, and your radio program coming up with other KSU folks, you'll even talk about that, I believe. Anyway, The point is that there is a forecast for some moisture in the next few weeks, but then a return to dryness for much of the month of August. So the corn market and these other markets, in seeing that, have basically taken into account what's right in front of them, i.e. rainfall. Mm-hmm. And so what that does set us up for, Samantha, is the issue of, well, we expect rainfall. Now, do we get inadequate amounts, or do we fall short? So that's a potential source of issue. So anyway, so we've seen the futures fall down. It is interesting that even in the last, I think you can argue, since early June, we've fallen off about $1. But when you look at what's happened in the last several weeks in terms of corn basis around the state, we've gained that $1 back. So when you look at Colby, from where we were about 5 or 6 weeks ago at about 50 over, now we're at $1.50 over. Garden City, really kind of the demand center leader for the state for corn, about 3 or 4 weeks ago was about 80 over. Now it's about $1.80 over. And really similar runs, if not even more pronounced, in Representative Salina, Elevators, Hutchinson, Topeka, and Columbus. So to the degree that the futures have fallen off, we've seen almost, if not as much or more, of an increase in the cash basis to offset those declines. To me, that's indicative of ongoing demand for any corn that users can get hold of out in the country, and just a strong cash corn market. So it's really kind of a stalemate in terms of what's happened in terms of futures falling off on the one hand, as opposed to local markets adjusting to the higher side. I would say, since we're talking about feed grains for grain sorghum, we haven't seen the basis weaken in most areas for sorghum, turning sideways to a little bit higher. That really the strongest move in the last several weeks for grain sorghum actually has come out of a market we watch in Columbus, Kansas, in the southeast corner of the state. About 4 weeks ago, they were running at about 20 under for basis, 15 to 20 under, and jumped up to 50 over in this same time period. Other places generally moving sideways to a little bit higher, a little bit of weakness in the southwest Kansas Garden City market. So interesting to watch that. You know, as we look at soybeans, they've also seen a similar drop for soybean futures. Again, in the last about the last 2 or 3 weeks, we're at about 15.50 for the August contract, or 16, just depends how far back you go. And now on yesterday's market, closed at about 14.18. So you dropped $1.50. We have seen for soybean basis during that same time a move to the higher side. Well, in Salina, strong representative market. About 4 or 5 weeks ago, we were trading at about $1.10 under, and now trading at about 20 to 30 under. So you've gained about 90 cents in terms of basis. So the loss in the futures market's been offset to some degree in most of these markets by most markets around the state of Kansas, at least in the major terminal locations, with some higher basis levels. Salina probably being the most pronounced. Topeka, also an export-oriented location, had a similar jump from about 90 under 4 or 5 weeks ago up to about 20 over. So you're seeing those interesting interactions, really a negative correlation between the drops that we've seen in the futures versus what we've seen in the cash markets. We also, before we went on the air, you and I were talking about what's happening in the wheat markets. And, of course, we've just had harvest, and during large harvest times, you'd see local wheat basis remain very, very weak for the most part. But we are seeing in the Colby market, in the Topeka market, in Salina, in Columbus, Hutchinson, at least sideways to a little bit higher, probably the most pronounced increase probably in northwest Kansas. Of course, we're seeing that increase in northwest Kansas, but we also have had major drought damage in northwest Kansas, so that could be part of the issue that they're looking at. Just on a side note, with the dryness, I don't know exactly where we're at in terms of wheat protein, and if we're seeing some, as dry conditions have tended to constrain yields, a number of times you'll see wheat proteins move to the higher side. So maybe what we do have may be getting better protein levels, and maybe that's part of what might be helping to move the wheat basis a little bit higher. But I guess something to watch for the next several weeks to see just where that wheat basis market goes as we move off into the future. And I would say in watching export numbers, we had a pretty good week in the last reported week ending July the 14th in terms of hard red winter wheat basis exports. So not a bad showing really in terms of hopefulness for where we might go in terms of hard red winter wheat. We have in this marketing year so far that started June the 1st, we have about total shipments and total sales amounting to about 33% of the USDA's projection of 245 million bushels, and we're only about 13.5 to 14% of the way through the marketing year. So there's some interest, and we'll see where that takes us in the near future.
Absolutely. An interesting time to be watching these futures for sure. Like you said, some of those drops being offset by local basis trends, which is always a good thing. But when we're thinking on a bit of a more global scale here, there's been some issues across the globe in terms of protests going on and obviously different conflicts. So can you tell us a little bit about that and maybe how it's playing into the market?
The one I'm most familiar with is what's happened in the Netherlands. My understanding is that there's been instituted a sharp reduction by governing authorities in the Netherlands in the amount of fertilizer that can be applied onto cropland. The number that I'd heard was closer to about 80% drop, which caused farmers in the Netherlands to en masse come out and protest that move. You're balancing that in the Netherlands with the ability to produce food for populations. If this move goes forth in the Netherlands, then at least for that country, their ability to produce crops would be dramatically hindered. So they would then basically throw the responsibility for providing adequate food to somebody else, but not them. So I think to the degree those types of moves are widespread, then you're looking at a major change in terms of the ability of global food systems to provide adequate grain for food and or industrial usage around the globe. So I don't want to be someone that's overreacting, but these are the logical issues that you have to deal with when you make moves such as Netherlands government had done to cut back on fertilizer usage as it has. And then first you have, in this case, a lot of concern on the farmer's part, and then you have a stark reality to have to deal with in terms of being able to produce adequate food. Of course, there are other issues around the globe, too, some financial issues in some countries. Italy, some others, Sri Lanka, having their issues as well. A lot of these have to do with food or energy. And agriculture is so closely linked to energy that either through biofuel production or having the ability to use energy-related inputs, either fuel for machinery or natural gas for production of nitrogen fertilizer, that you really have a close link between the type of policies that are being discussed in these various countries and the ability of these countries to be self-sufficient in terms of food supplies. So, Samantha, as you mentioned that, it's a very important issue. And if you stand back and wonder where are grain markets going next year, well, to the degree that this year we're having dry conditions and probably constrained production in the United States for at least corn and probably soybeans, too, the way this is playing out. And some of these other issues across the globe, Europe, very dry right now, Eastern former Soviet Union countries having some dry conditions, although Russia's got a good crop. South America having some dry weather, particularly in Argentina. It's hard to see a huge reactive increase coming in supplies that would take crop prices much lower in the near future. So these issues we're having right now, some from weather, some from policies, environmental policies, really set us up to have probably all that much more of strength in the commodity markets, grain commodities, heading off into 2023. And if you're a seller of grain, well, you're happy with that. But if you're from the broader humanitarian food supply perspective, it's worrisome. You just can't have many shortfalls like that before you really start to constrain particularly low-income countries and their ability to provide adequate food for their populations.
Once again, that was Dan O'Brien. He is a grain market economist here at K-State, providing us with this week's grain market update. We'll be back with more ahead on Agriculture Today. This is Agriculture Today. We are back now with our special guest for our water segment for the week, and his name is Ron Graber. He is a K-State watershed specialist who also works with K-Care. Is that right, Ron?
That's correct, Samantha.
Excellent. Well, today, like I said, you're going to be talking to us for our water segment for the week, which we've been heavily hitting on this month of July. It's a pertinent topic with everything going on, considering how hot and dry it's been in the state. So, Ron, tell us a little bit about what you do in your work with working with landowners and producers.
Sure. So I work as an extension watershed specialist, as you mentioned. There's a team of 5 of us scattered around different parts of the state, and our role really is to function in the water quality arena with producers, and varies from livestock situations where we may be providing assistance with confined feeding operations, water sources for those cattle, to we also work in the crop area. So we do some things in terms of helping producers look at changing the way that they do tillage on their fields, maybe how they apply nutrients, all of those things that have the potential to not only affect our water quality in terms of our streams and rivers and lakes as far as surface runoff, but also really can help a producer be more efficient in the way they operate and they farm. And, that's kind of the bottom line. They need to be efficient and be able to show a profit.
Absolutely. And I think when we think about water conservation is a topic that comes to mind. But something that's often missed, which is so important, is, like you mentioned, water quality.
Yeah, absolutely. So, quantity, and we're all facing that right now, or most of us in the state are facing water quantity issues. But, if we have a pond, for instance, that maybe is 2/3 full of water, but the quality is not desirable, then basically it's of no value to us. So we really need to pay attention, especially from a livestock standpoint, and with the hot, dry conditions and water levels shrinking in those, and we start to see them become a little bit stagnant, algae growth. Once in a while we'll have some that are located in where we may see some salinity issues and things where cattle maybe don't want to drink the water or forced to drink water that's really poor quality.
You've mentioned quite a few of those issues that when it comes to water quality just then, but let's really break down some of those a little bit more. We've talked about it previously on the show, the issues that revolve around blue-green algae, but that's not where water quality concerns end, right?
Yeah, that's correct. The blue-green is the big one that we've talked about quite a bit, or we tend to see in the press. And I think it's not only because it affects livestock, but it has potential to affect pets and humans as well. And so we see these advisories show up on lakes, but it sometimes shows up in these farm ponds, and we don't realize it's there until we find dead cattle. And so that's a big one, and it's really out there at the forefront. But yeah, there's some other things that we can see in there, sediment, really murky kinds of water that, might not necessarily be a health hazard from those suspended solids, but it provides a water that maybe livestock aren't interested in drinking. And so if we, when we're having 100-degree days, they can consume a lot of water, and we've got water that's maybe not desirable. They may not meet their water quality needs for the day. So that's a big one. We also can see some of the other things like salinity can show up in some areas. And, again, if we have high salinity in water, then they really back off and don't want to consume quantities that they need. And I think sometimes we don't realize how much water livestock actually consume. And we tend to use kind of a gallon per 100 pounds of body weight as a standard kind of rule of thumb. Okay, so if we have that 1,200-pound cow, maybe she's going to drink 12 gallons per day. But that's in kind of a normal, cooler situation, maybe having, a little more moisture in the feed. So we get to days like we're having now and experiencing these 100-degree days. Instead of being 12 gallons, it might be 25 gallons a day. And that needs to be clean, fresh water. And so, so now all of a sudden, whether we're, in that pond situation or maybe we have tanks and wells, what we thought was enough water may not be. And, one of the things that we look at is, if we do have a well and tanks, are we on a pressure system? Is it a windmill? Is it a solar system? If it's a solar system, we like to see tanks that are big enough to have a 3-day supply of water for those cattle. Again, if we're thinking back on those numbers and we maybe have 50 cows in that pasture, now we're talking about a lot of water in tanks that's available. And so, we really need to think hard about that. I'd sure remind producers that they just need to be checking those tanks very regular this kind of weather. Sometimes, we think about checking cattle once a week in pastures during the summer. Well, once a week's not often enough now. So, even if we do have that 2 or 3 day supply, that means we need to be in there looking at them every 2 to 3 days to make sure that they do have water.
I'm not the only one that's been checking my weather app on my phone as often as I possibly can, just hoping for even a small percentage, a small chance of rain. And I think, like you said, a reminder that kind of one of those best practices that producers should be doing is checking on their cattle maybe a bit more frequently than they're used to.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's just critical. And there's other things that affect how much water they'll consume besides just the temperature, but humidity plays into that. And it's amazing in Kansas how much humidity we can have when we're really, really dry. But shade, whether or not we have a wind, all of those things can help with keeping those cattle cool, in addition to the water supply.
Absolutely. And in terms of some other best practices when it comes to water quality concerns, when you're talking to producers, what are some of those main things that you kind of hit on?
Some of the things that we really like to remind producers is this is an excellent time of year to do maintenance on their feeding pens. Got a lot of folks that do kind of fall winter backgrounding, and maybe they don't have any cattle in those lots, or even if they do, this is the prime time to take a look at the lots and make sure we get the manure scraped up, cleaned out, spread on fields, and get it out of there and take a look at those lots. Oftentimes, if we have some wet periods during the winter, we'll get areas that maybe we have some holes develop, so we don't get the drainage we need, or maybe in that process of scraping and cleaning manure out, things will happen so that we don't get drainage that we need to out of the pens. We like to see these pens somewhere in a 2 to 5% slope to ensure adequate drainage. And another thing, we'll see, manure kind of build up along the fence line, and that just, it acts like a little dike or a terrace and prevents drainage. So clean all of that out, scrape, maybe shoot some slopes, make sure that we've got good, even drainage. We may need to haul in some clay and fill in some areas. And it's a great time, especially with it being dry. And, we're kind of between harvest and planting seasons. And so, it's just a prime time to get in there and do that maintenance and kind of get it back in shape and ready to go for fall, because a lot of those guys will start buying calves here in another month, 6 weeks. And so let's get in and do some of that below that pen. We like to see vegetative buffers below the pen. We need to go in there and do a little maintenance too. If we've had some of that material that has drained out and is kind of piled up, maybe outside of the pen or in that filter area, let's get that cleaned up as well, and may need to go back in and reseed that brome or, whatever grass it was that was in there. And we're coming up on the prime time to plant brome. We usually kind of say mid-September to mid-October here in central Kansas. So, let's get that kind of cleaned up too and get it ready to go and maybe reseed it so that we do get that drainage out of those pens and quickly buffer that stuff before it does maybe get to a protected water body.
Absolutely. Good reminders for sure. I think we're in the thick of summer now, but we forget that only in a few months it'll be here before we know it, that fall season will be here. So a good reminder of things to keep up with right now. But Ron, if listeners are tuning in and they're thinking, well, I want more resources in terms of I want to learn more about what Ron Graber believes are best practices and what I should be doing right now, where can they find those resources at?
Sure. So, in terms of feedlot maintenance and maybe that confined feeding area wasn't designed the best when it was designed, or whatever, maybe there needs to be some changes made, and we as watershed specialists are a resource for that. And so on the K-Care website, our emails, phone numbers, I would encourage producers, if they're thinking about maybe having somebody take a look at their feeding operation, make some suggestions, contact one of us. We're all part of K-State Extension. There's no fee attached. One of the things that sometimes producers are concerned about is, confidentiality with what we see and what we talk about. And, everything with us is confidential. We'll come, take a look, visit about the operation. And, at the end of the day, then it's kind of up to the producer on how they want to move forward with changes, and we're certainly willing to help them come up with some plans, designs on things they might be able to do. The other thing I would point out is, again, on our K-Care website, we do have a number of publications on there with some great information. There's ones with how to design and, some of those design characteristics in terms of feeding pens and maintenance and those kinds of things, how to do that. In terms of the water sources, we've got some great information there on solar water systems, tire tanks, all of those kinds of things as well. So, if you're looking for some of that kind of information, that's a great place to start.
Excellent. Well, as always, that website will be included in the show notes of today's program, which can be found on agtoday.net. But Ron, thank you so much for your time this afternoon.
Sure. It was great to visit with you.
You as well. Once again, that was Ron Graber. He is our K-State watershed specialist, visiting with us about water quality concerns in livestock. We'll be back with more ahead on Agriculture Today. This is Agriculture Today. We are ending this Friday's program, as we always do, with our meteorologist, Chip Redmond. He's going to provide us with this week's agricultural weather update. So, Chip, thanks for joining us.
Yep, sorry I don't have better news.
Well, I know we talked last week and we weren't too optimistic then, but we're bringing a little bit more doom and gloom with this weather report. So what do current conditions really look like across the state?
Yeah, it's not been a pretty picture over the last week. We've had 100-degree days for pretty much the entire state, and even temperatures as warm as 111 again in the southwest. Unfortunately, we had mostly sunny skies, and that just optimized the heat and really helped dry things out and brown things up. We did have some areas of very localized showers that fell in parts of the northwest and southwest and south central, but overall really no meaningful precipitation, and that basically accumulates to 2 weeks now without any rain at all. Things are getting very dry. In the drought monitor this week, we saw widespread degradation. The drought monitor, we saw abnormally dry, basically go from southeast Kansas. Now that stretches almost all the way up to I-70 in all of eastern Kansas. Western half of the state still all in at least moderate drought. and we saw expansions of extreme drought as well as exceptional drought in the Southwest. So big changes. We're kind of in a period of what we call rapid onset drought or flash drought across the majority of the state.
Well, with conditions like that, we're obviously going to see negative results because of it. So what have you really observed in the field when it comes to how this weather has really affected things that are currently growing?
Yeah, I took a tour across the state this week, basically from the Southwest up to Hayes and over to Manhattan. And I'll tell you, there's several areas where things were still green, at least with the grasses, but overall crop stress was there across the whole region. Especially what surprised me was the sorghum. Sorghum is just in areas that looked like it struggled to come up, and then even the stuff that did come up was rolled up and really struggling and even browning in some places in the Southwest. And so sorghum's a drought-tolerant crop, and when you see it stressed that much, that's a big red flag. I know there are some other additional issues. Even corn are just not quite cooling down enough at night to really help. We kind of are in that, or just past the silking stage where it's starting to fill, and it needs to cool down at night, and it's just not getting cool enough. So big stressors. And it's really impressive, though, is just how brown the grasses have gotten over the last 2 weeks in a lot of those areas. And even in far south, it's incredibly dry and been incredibly warm. And as a result, we have seen some fires across the state, mostly in Northwest. The CRP opened up for emergency swathing, and so we have additional hay. They've been starting fires with that. And then we've also had dry lightning as well start fires. Thankfully, there's still some green buffers, so the fires are getting checked up and caught easily. But man, all we need to do is introduce some wind, and we could end up with significant fire potential on our hands.
Well, definitely concerning for sure. But we had our new monthly outlooks that came out today. What have they really shown? Anything optimistic at all?
Yeah, the monthly outlooks did come out today. I'll start with probably the most optimistic is the shorter term. It looks like we're going to have a brief breakdown of this high pressure early next week that did put us in the above normal category for precipitation across the whole state for early next week. And so hopefully we can get some moisture. Keep in mind it's going to be convective in nature, so that summertime thunderstorm, you're under it, you're going to get dumped on. A couple miles away, you could get completely missed. So we could see some potential brief flooding issues if that you do optimize that precipitation in the same place over and over again, but they'll be few and far between, I think. Overall, though, that's not just going to be a drop in the bucket. It looks like that ridge builds back in for August and really persists through most of the month as we have moderate favorability to above normal temperatures as well as below normal precipitation persisting through August. So we have a brief improvement. Long-term, probably not so much.
Well, I know we'll all take what we can get in this short-term outlook that you gave. So hopefully, like you said, it doesn't result in flooding, but it results in enough rain to carry us through whatever persistent drought we have to come. But Chip, as always, thank you so much for your time.
Yep, thanks for having me.
Once again, that was Chip Redmond. He is our K-State meteorologist. That concludes this Friday's programming, but as always, we will be back with more next week. For Agriculture Today, I'm Samantha Bennett with the K-State Radio Network.